Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. So happy to see all of you. I hope you had a nice first day yesterday. And it's my big honor and my pleasure to introduce the second day and our first keynote speaker, Jeroen Huisman. Jeroen holds a PhD from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. He was appointed professor at the University of Bath. In 2013, he moved to the beautiful country Belgium at the University of Ghent to start a position in the Department of Sociology, where he is a director of the Center of Higher Education Governance, Ghent. He's editor of Higher Education Policy and co-editor of the book series Theory and Method in Higher Education Research, editorial board member of various higher education journals. His research interests are quite large, from change from government to governance in higher education, the dynamics of organizational change, diversity in higher education, institutional management and governance, quality assurance, and internationalization in higher education. I think we can be very honored to have Jeroen giving this keynote, and I would like to give you the floor. Please, Jeroen.
Thank you very much. Wait until you hear me out first before you give an applause. It's great to be here. Thank you, Bruno, for introducing me. Thank you, EAIR, for inviting me for giving this keynote address. Wonderful to be here back again. Back again refers to traveling back in time.
Just a second.
Thank you. This was my first presentation for EAIR, 1993. Were you born already? Yes, you were. Yeah. This goes back quite a while. This was my first presentation at EAIR. I remember vividly, I sometimes wake up during the night, 6 attendees in the room where I gave my presentation, among them 2 close colleagues, but okay, 4 other interested people. So I'm really pleased to see at least a few more attending my presentation today. So 1993 it was. Okay, so you also see a nice picture which is taken shortly after the conference. I'm the one in the middle. You might recognize another higher education researcher, Velima. We are going from one conference to a training course, and that's how I look like at that moment. Fast forward to 2023, 30 years later. I think I can say, but it's self-acclaimed, of course, I developed from a novice in the field to at least somebody with a bit of experience in this area of higher education research. Older, definitely, as you can see, if you compare the 2 pictures. Wiser, I'll leave that to others to decide. I'm not sure. Yes, in many respects, maybe not in all respects. Sadder, definitely not. So this is actually the step up to what I'm trying to share with you today, what my aim is. I'm not going to lament on higher education research that we're doing poorly, that it's all going down the drain. Sometimes seasoned scholars are tempted to make such claims and to support those claims. No, not at all. I'm actually quite optimistic, but I think there are areas where we can do better. There's always room for improvement. So this is what I like to do in the short time allocated. I briefly reflect on the state of the art in higher education. I'll specify that a little bit more in 2 slides. It's a reflection, it's a personal reflection. I will use, of course, some evidence, some support for my claims, but it's just a feeling that I'd like to share with you, and I'm inviting you to respond to that and to say either you're totally wrong, or more modestly, I see it differently. It's a debate I'd like to engage in. It's food for thought. So, a long list of topics I thought about to include in this presentation. But given that we only have half an hour or so, I have to make a selection, and I'll skip a couple of topics. I'll mainly talk about the use of theory and the use of methods in higher education research. These are areas I feel comfortable to talk about. To put the parameter around that, I can't cover what's happening in the full field. You know, to stay abreast of what's happening in our field, you would actually need to read all day and all night, even more than that. So to really be aware of all the developments is impossible. So I thought for this presentation, I focus on what I see in the journals on higher education. What is presented there in terms of theory and method. And this is not to cover myself, but I'd like to make clear that what I'm saying is I'm painting with broad strokes. That relates to what I said earlier. It's a big area, so it's difficult to cover that. So I have to go a little bit generalistic, generic in my assessments and developments. Take also into account that when we're talking about theory and method, everybody has probably a different conception of these labels. What is theory? What is method? I don't have the time to go in depth in this area. I'd like to refer to what I think is a nice chapter on that. Smith and colleagues, a couple of years back in Theory and Method in Higher Education Research, a series that I co-edited with Malcolm Tide, Lancaster University. She and her colleagues looked at how theory has been used in different journals, higher education journals, and you will not surprise, she came to the conclusion that there's so much variety in how people actually use and present theory. So I'm using broad strokes, forgive me. So reflecting on those 30-some years I've been in the field of higher education, I think we can be optimistic and positive about the broad generic development. If you look back at writings in the 1970s and 1980s about higher education, and you do, because you do want to know what is the background of our field, what have people been studying in those days. What to me is clear is that in the early days, we had many people who were not so much hardcore researchers, either in the field of higher education or in disciplines, who were using theory and method. They were observers, they were eyewitnesses, sometimes in the eye of the storm, but they were seeing things that were happening to their higher education institution, and they were reflecting on that. That's great, that's good, but obviously we need to move beyond storytelling and observations. And in those days I saw very limited attention to theory and methods. People were writing down what they saw. I see progress in that sense. If you now take journals in our field, you see that many more people take a reflective stance on where we are in our field. We see much more sophisticated use of theory and method. I refer to a couple of special issues of journals like Higher Education Research and Development. I must mention the work of Malcolm Tide, looking at theory and method in higher education. Sometimes it's personal reflections, sometimes a little bit sketchy, but in most of the times these are stable, robust analysis of where we are in the field, also in terms of use of theory and method. So generally, yes, a good development. First issue, methods in higher education. Now I'm becoming a little bit more critical towards the use of methods. Why do we use methods? It may seem obvious, but it's good to repeat that. I take a quote just from one of the core textbooks in methods in social sciences. Methods allow researchers to independently and impartially test pre-existing theories and prior findings, subject them to open debate, modifications, or enhancements. Dry, but I think it's good to repeat that. That's why we need methods in our work. Paul Ashman and Jan Kees have very briefly but very aptly summarize this as the tools to interrogate theories. Why do we do that? Well, because we want to convince our fellow researchers that we've done our research in a proper way. Sound, logical, confirmable, repeatable, scrutinizable, trustworthy, these are the terms that you also see in these textbooks. That's why we would use methods in our research. If we then briefly reflect on what kind of tools we use from this broad toolbox, this is an observation based on reading a couple of articles that have looked back on the use of methods in higher education research. So here's a relatively recent paper by FHOOE. She looked at 6 journals, higher education journals, very long time period, 20 years. She came to the conclusion that in terms of quantitative methods, so 3/4 of these articles used standard regression models, sometimes multiple, sometimes multi-level regression, and a smaller part used rather basic tasks like analysis of variance or chi-square tests. Okay, I'll let that sink in. I'm not commenting on that yet. I'm giving some other examples. Malcolm Tide, more broadly, looking both at qualitative and quantitative methods, came to the conclusion that about half of the papers in journals that he looked at, 2010, half of the papers used multivariate techniques, 25.25 use documentary research, interviews are often used, and actually what Wells and colleagues looked at in 2015, looking at 3 US journals, 60% correlational studies, some 20+% descriptive research, and 30% longitudinal research. Well, the image that pops up to me, open for discussion, is nice, quantitative research, qualitative research, but it appears to me that people stay very close to the tools that are in the upper compartment of the toolbox, the easy methods you can pick. I must say there is a lot of geographic variety. Malcolm Tide has done research on it, comparing US journals and European journals. He's found quite some differences to that, so that's a qualification. But overall, here is my first hypothesis, or actually question. Is there a limited use of the tool set, the available tool set? Well, you can easily counter that by saying, well, it's all fitness for purpose, isn't it? You choose your method because it fits your research question and topic that you are researching. If you're doing an economic analysis, it is very likely that you look for the quantitative side of the toolbox and you use these methods. If you're really interested in the inner motivations of students going to universities, you might be tempted to choose qualitative design and use in-depth interviews. So yes, I'm aware that there is something like fitness for purpose. But then again, looking at what these other authors said and my own observations of what is presented in contemporary higher education journals, I hardly see scholars using a keyword, a historical analysis, critical discourse analysis, storytelling, shadowing, autoethnography, photo voice, multi-level regression, QCA, machine learning techniques. Just a number of tools that are available for analysis of higher education that we hardly use. And you can counter that and say, yeah, but you're now mentioning techniques that are a bit obscure, not much used, and maybe not that good, possibly. But striking, I think, that we don't use more of these methods. So it could be as limited use of the tool set. Comment 2, might there be a tendency to use less sophisticated techniques? Like I said, we are grabbing the tools from the upper compartment of the toolbox. Of course, it takes you a lot of time to work with a database with a huge data set that you need to clean and to work with. Yes, if you're doing interviews, you need a lot of time to digest these, to write them out, to do the analysis. Sure, I do understand that. But then again, here I sense that we are looking for the easy way out. Also here again, a qualification. We should not use very advanced, sophisticated techniques to explain the obvious. Also here, the fitness for purpose argument applies. This nice quote from Cheslov and Rios IKEA, you should not employ advanced models for trivial ends. Sure, I do understand that. But then again, there is very limited attention, I think, in our field for experiments, for quasi-experiments, causal inference, issues like measurement invariance, selection bias, heterogeneity. I feel that a lot of these very challenging questions are swept under the carpet and are not sufficiently addressed. There are scholars, yes, I'm looking at you, Vic, for your nice contribution together with you to theory and method in higher education, where people ask attention for these methodological challenges. But overall, in the journals, I see limited attention for this. And my argument here is that we can make a division between tools and strong tools. And I'm of the view that the sophisticated techniques, the stronger tools, are often unused in our field. So these are two comments on the use of methods. I'll move on to theory. Again, don't need to talk that long, I think, about what is theory exactly. Textbook quote, Babby, a systematic explanation for observed facts. Merton said a long time ago, theory is the answer to the queries of why. That's of course what we want to achieve. We don't only want to describe what's happening in our field, we also want to explain it. The answer to the why question. And let me be clear here as well, same goes for methods. I'm not taking a particular stance in terms of paradigm. My argument applies to those who are positivistic in their approach and those who are interpretive scholars. That's not a point I want to make. Irrespective of the paradigm adhered to, you would need, one way or another, a theoretical approach. Going back to what I said earlier, theory comes in all kinds of guises. Theory, capital T, middle range theory, theory in action, grounded theory. That's not the point I'm making. Any theory would help us to analyze higher education. So here's also some good news, I think. Malcolm Tide has argued convincingly, I think, that some 20 years ago, his view was that we were a theoretical community of practice. That covers it nicely. We were practice researchers, we were observing, analyzing what we encountered in our daily practice, and we tried to make sense of that. Nothing wrong with that. On his recent work, Malcolm Tide tries to argue that higher education actually evolving into a discipline. So it's coming close to some of the disciplines that we look at in the social sciences. So that would be good news in terms of the use of methods in higher education, but particularly use of theory. But this is my question again, half hypothesis. How is theory actually used in our community? And here you see criticism by my fellow scholars in the field. Malcolm Tide already analyzed, again, the sample of 2010 journals. There is quite often a very implicit use of theory. Scholars are referring to theory, but they don't show what they're actually doing with that theory. And he also observed that there was a limited level of sophistication. People are presenting broad theories, very generic sense, but not further developing that. In different words, but basically boiling down to the same message, Paul Ashwin, in the 2012 article, he also came to the conclusion that there's limited use of theory to conceptualize the research. And in a recent article by Julian Hamann and Kosmitsky, I found a similar argument that there's a need for explicating in theory work. What I think this all boils down to is that we are too rigidly presenting a theory, but do not sufficiently engage with that. What are the underpinnings of that theory, and how do we move from such a theory to an application in a particular context? I'll come back to a little bit more of this later on. But these are my 3 points, and these are basically open, of course, for discussion with you now or in the breaks or later on. A limited use of the methodological tool sets, my observation. A tendency to use less sophisticated techniques. And theory is used, yes, but not always evident that it's done in a proper way. Why should we use it? Well, the obvious goal and objective is, of course, to increase our scholarly understanding of a certain phenomenon. Not a lament, an observation. I think we're doing well, we're growing as a society, we're growing as a community, but there are many areas where we can improve. Maybe we should try to dig a little bit deeper, and if this is correct, that we try to answer the question, how does this come about? This is, again, my impression. If we are particularly looking at journals in our field, we tend to adhere to a model where academic publishing is product-oriented. Of course, as a researcher, you go through a process to produce something, but ultimately, what appears in the journal is a text, a flat text that doesn't move anymore. It is institutionalized, a product that can be read, can be digested, but not much more than that. In that context, my impression is that scholars compete for finding a space in these journals. There's limited space. It's offered by commercial publishers who have different objectives than we have. And it's a prestige economy. We all would like to publish a paper in established journals, in top journals, so-called top journals in our field or in the disciplines. My point is that these products are rationalized representations following an institutional format. We can't escape in the scope of a journal article of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 words from the format, an intro, a literature review, theory, methods, findings, etc. That's the kind of institutional, it's an institutional given that we adhere to that format. And as with all institutions, it forms also a bit of a straitjacket where you can't escape from. You must adhere to these rules to be able to publish in a good journal. And take into account that product should also then be of a relatively short length. In that context, my observation is that people are presenting their methods and they vehemently try to defend their choice for a method, but do often not see the other side. So it is as Fiona Hallett has written, it's a form of idolatry. People endorse certain methods because they think this is the best way to do this research. I'm a fan of a particular method, so I must defend my choice. But that choice is then limited to giving praise to a particular method without, what I would like to see in an article, why have not other methods been chosen? What has led you to this particular choice, given that there's a broad range of methods available for you as a scholar? This is, I think, the culminating point. That product that we read is a text that actually does not present, it actually obscures, the thinking process, quite often the thinking process of the scholar. And if I can't see the thinking process of the scholar, it's very difficult to engage with the arguments of that scholar. It's hidden, it's not visible. And I argue that then this format puts rather a limit to the opportunities to learn from journal articles, either as a novice scholar or even as an experienced scholar. And point B, I also think it limits our creativity in going about theory and about methods. Maybe this is the underlying problem, but okay, that's my interpretation of what is happening in our field. So that leads me then to a very interesting paradox, isn't it? Because generally we would say the journals in our field, in our discipline, they are seen, the contributions to the journals are seen as the hallmark of our stock of knowledge. That's the tip of the iceberg that has survived review processes, that has appeared, and we say, yes, this must be shared with a broad audience. That is also visible in all kinds of higher education policies, in research evaluation processes, journal rankings, and what have you. That's the kind of game that we play. But my argument is that they are not very good vehicles for conversation, for exchange, for discussion, for developmental thinking. And hence, that's one of the final conclusions, I think, there's little evidence for real progress in our field. If we continue to write in these journal articles, then there are limitations to what will bring us further, big leaps in our field. I'll close down with some suggestions, solutions, questions mark. Well, it's too obvious, but I couldn't resist to put this down. Well, yes, I say this with tongue-in-cheek, of course, but I hope it sets us to thinking about it, whether we really get our products, the things we are proud of, the things we work on as a researcher, to really get them into journals, or whether we should look for other avenues. I'm very enthusiastic. I only recently discovered this, to my shame, I must say. What I'm saying is, of course, not totally new. I'm also using stuff that is already around. And what I said earlier, what these higher education researchers said about the use of theory, that they don't engage with theory, is nicely reflected of the work of, for instance, Svedberg, a sociologist. Recently, an article of a year ago, he has a very nice argument about theory as text and theory as an activity. And the way I see it, and that's echoed by the higher education scholars, we treat theory as text. It's a dead thing in the sense that you present concepts, ideas from a theory, and you try to apply that. The argument by Svedberg is that we should change our view on that, and we should see theory as an activity. Theory is actually not a good use. We should talk about theorizing. That's also what Sue Clegg said 10 years ago. It's a verb. we should work with theory instead of having a shallow presentation of core concepts. So we must engage with that, and we must explain how we link theoretical vocabulary to phenomena in the real world. There's a risk in this approach, in the sense that we've all now been educated to write these 7,000 words articles for journals. So how do we get out of that straitjacket? Maybe the judges in our field, peer reviewers, don't like this theorizing. They say, no, we want the shorter version of it. We want crystal clear intro, theory, method, findings, conclusions. So it might be difficult to make this all work, but I really call upon you, and I'd like to contribute to that myself as well, to pay more attention to theory as an activity, and basically that applies to methods as well. Third idea, but there might be many more other ideas. If we may not want to stop publishing in journals, we could at least think about using other kinds of outlets and other kinds of conversations that will really help us to better understand each other in terms of methods and theory. So my call would be to use offer, sorry for the mistake there, dissemination channels for our research outcomes. That's my contribution for today. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Jeroen. We have, I think, 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So, who wants to ask the first question? Please.
Could I just ask a question here?
President, we need a microphone to you.
Yeah.
Does it work? It's on. My name is David Campbell from the University for Continuing Education, Krems. It was very interesting tour de force keynote you gave, and the question that was formulated would be in the sense of a little bit referring to theory development or theory evolution. And I think on your last slide, of course, you made many comments. But let us assume we would be sitting now in a theory of higher education seminar at the beginning of the 22nd century. I mean, it could be in Linz or in the Netherlands. So in which ways would you speculate perhaps theory or theories about higher education may be evolving further in the next 100 years? So what may be the status, so to say? Of course, it's a fantasy, it's speculation and so on. Yeah. But from your side, if you could give us a hint here. So we entered the time machine to travel. What may it be we're going to find in 100 years from now?
Yeah, yeah. I have the faint hope that I will be re-invited to give another keynote in 30 years' time, so I could answer that question. Standing here, yeah. I am not that hopeful about really theory development, if you mean theory of higher education. I'm still in a position, and I disagree with Malcolm Tite about that, but that we're moving towards a discipline. I don't see sufficient support that we are developing like sociology, political sciences, communication studies, like any other social field. I think we're still observing a phenomenon. I think, because that issue was on the list for the journal meeting, a topic like sustainability as well. There is no, in my humble opinion, a theory of sustainability. Neither is there a theory of higher education. So if I can change your question and use a concept like mid-range theory, I think that applies to higher education. We can move very much into theorizing certain elements, and I think we should put our bets on what we're doing in learning and teaching. I think that is, in my view, the most developed area of where we have insights about what works, what does not work. It's not a full answer yet, but we have deeper insights, I think, there than, for instance, in system developments. And I would put my bets on mid-range theories and help developing that further, hoping that there will be progress, but not in the sense of grand theories that in 50 years' time we will have the answer to all our questions. Does that cover more or less what you were aiming?
Well, I do not have fans, so I'm just curious.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hello again. You said one sentence that interested me very much, Jeroen, and I'd just like to invite you to deepen and develop the concept a little bit for us. So maybe this is at the core of your speech. You said the product can obscure the thinking process. That's an extremely interesting sentence, and I would like to invite you to elaborate on it.
In a journal article, we have to convince reviewers and ultimately later on readership that they've done the proper thing. And we have only around 8,000 words available to tell our story. And that story, in my view, cannot be much more than putting forward your theoretical choice, your methodological choice, findings and results. What I would like to see is more like a novel that you're with the writer, or the reader of the text, that shows you the developmental process. And you know that well. We all know that. The first, let me talk about my experience, the first version of an article is 12,000 words. You write, you want to explain in quite some detail how you arrived at your conclusions, how you see the theory compared to other theories. And then you have these 12,000 words, and you know what will happen if you submit it. So what happens then is in editing and re-editing your work, you strip it of your process-related comments. And what remains then is a bit of a stale presentation of facts instead of a process. Does that clarify?
Okay, thank you. We have 4 more questions.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, and thank you for your inspiring talk. And I think it's given us so much food for thought. Susan Harrison from University of Education in Ludwigsburg. I'm going to open perhaps a can of worms here, at risk of doing so. But I wondered what because you mentioned it in your keynote, this whole notion of repeatability in research. Now, as we know, social science is a moving target. At any given moment in time, things and situations and opinions and so forth change. So I was wondering what you thought about whether we need to actually maintain that paradigm or actually make a cut and say, right, it's more important that we show how we go about our research, but it does not necessarily have to be this notion of repeatableness. So that's the first question. And the second one is, in regards to the training of methods and theories, education as a discipline, as an entire discipline, is an import discipline. So we have people coming in from a whole range of different disciplines, and especially in the terms of the education of young scholars, what is an idea how we can improve the training of methods and theories so that the questions that you're raising can possibly be promoted to broaden the scope of theories and methods in use?
Thank you. Second question first. A challenge is there because we know that we're coming from quite different backgrounds. If we would all have a background in education, it would be easier. to exchange thoughts. We would have the same point of departure. But in our field, that's not the case, because we also have political scientists, we have philosophers, we have historians, even in our field. So that makes it difficult to prep everybody in the same way. The way out, I think, is, going back to what I presented, just be creative and stand up and present another method, a method that comes from your discipline. If you're coming from anthropology, yes, push the point of doing in-depth interviews, using shadowing as a technique, etc., etc. Dare to present your storyline, and that allows for communication with that other scholars who said, well, I've always looked at this in a quantitative manner, but this helps me to understand. So I would be thinking that we not necessarily have to change the preparation, but we should open channels for communication about the use of different methods and theories. So that's more post-training than part of the training. And of course, I lost your first question. Please. Now, please, in one sentence, what was the...
The first question was about the notion or the paradigm of maintaining repeatableness.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't be too optimistic, and that also relates to my answer to David, whether there will be a grand theory on higher education in 20 years' time. But then again, on the other side, I think the risk of fragmentation, of too much variety is looming largely in our field, because you might look at something you're interested in, I look at a slightly related phenomenon, but actually we can already not talk to each other anymore in terms of theory and methods because of our choices. I had a discussion with Carlijn a couple of months ago about repeatability and particularly replication studies in our field. Maybe not all of the areas that we are researching are suited for that, sure. But it still strikes me as odd that I haven't seen, tell me if there are that many replication studies. There are methodological challenges, etc. But I think we should put in a little bit more of effort in doing that. Not with the aim to have the grand theory of higher education in 10 years' time, but at least to make some progress.
Okay, thank you. The next one was the gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeroen. Very insightful presentation indeed. I don't have a question, it's more like a comment or personal reflection, and it includes many points. First of all, it's that I'm 10 years younger than you. I presented in Limerick in 2003 in EAIR conference, that's my first paper. So I have 20 years being in the field, so to speak, and I'm not as mature as you are, but I would say many of the things you said in your presentations were very accurate. As a researcher, I'm really somehow distressed by the fact most of the European studies are case studies of something, which applies some loose framework or a little bit more tighter framework. And the bottom line in these studies is that you have a common framework, and then people are doing country cases, and then they find exactly those things which are in the framework and say that, hey, I did find these things in my own country. And for this I do it by myself, so I don't criticize anybody else. I'm criticizing also by myself, but that's actually a very boring thing, and it doesn't add anything except that you can have applications of that particular framework or a model showed in different kinds of contexts. But when it comes to the discussion about whether we are disciplined or not, definitely we're not a discipline, and definitely we shouldn't be a discipline from my perspective. Because why? I mean, what's the added value of having some grand theory of higher education? You mentioned about the diversity, or in a way that it gets to distract, or what was the word you mentioned? But anyway, I mean that I don't think we need anything like some common denominator which pulls us together. I think these forums are very nice people coming from different backgrounds, different disciplines, practitioners, policymakers. And that's reaching us in these days. I think like being a discipline is something which was very cool in 70s. And you had journals where professors were debating like, are we disciplined or not? Take like the sociology of administration, and then there was administrative science, and then there was a huge fight whether it's a discipline or not. And by the way, somebody said that if you need to add the word science in your discipline, you are not a science. Medical science, no, probably. Oh, my final point is, which I almost forgot, I guess, is that we should be happy about being very close of being a practitioner's interest. So many of us are working also as a consultants. Many of us are working in working groups. Many of us are teaching future experts and professionals in higher education. I think this is our contribution. We shouldn't be too much envying the so-called hard disciplines or these kind of traditional, let's say, more appreciated disciplines. But at the same time, we really need to get rid of these case studies based on certain framework kind of articles. And that's mainly the gatekeepers, the journals, who should do something about it.
Thank you. It was a comment, so I'm not commenting on that, but it gives me the opportunity to echo also one element that you stressed. I think it's important as well. I have sinned as well. Of course, I'm not presenting this as I'm doing all these things in the proper way. No, I'm also doing a case study, and I also look for some obvious candidates in my research. You can easily trace that in my work. But indeed, I think we should put in a little bit more effort and to do more than that. Thank you, Jussi.
We have to keep timing a little bit. So I know there are much more people who would like to ask questions to you. I suggest that you take a picture during your coffee break.
Sure.
But the last question maybe from my head, and then we'll have to close this session.
And I give you 30 years to answer it. Let me turn, Jeroen, from the output. I totally agree with you on the comments on journals and stuff. To the input side. We live in an age of data explosion. We have a wealth of data at our fingertips, literally. Shouldn't that, that's the first question, shouldn't that lead to a reconsideration of techniques and methods? Second, the ownership of that data is being commercialized with the speed of light by our dear publishers that are shifting their business models from our journals to that. What does that mean? Competition for us? And would that be good?
No, you have to wait 30 years for the answer. Thanks. Yeah, it was, I think, clear also, and there was a suggestion in my presentation, the commercial publishers have different objectives than we have. They're in it for the money. No? And okay, we can't blame them for that. But it has repercussions. You're pointing at a very important element of that. I'm not sure whether I fully agree with rich data. I think there's a lot of information out there which not necessarily is appropriate data for analysis. But I do hear what you say, and I would definitely echo that we should be careful that we preserve our own rights to information and data, and let not other people, certainly not publishers, run away with that. But the final answer is in 30 years.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeroen, for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.